Welcome to our Culturally Responsive Teaching webinar focused on classroom management. Many times it is easy to be overwhelmed when we think of the many needs we must meet as teachers. However, classroom management and procedures help to create not only an environment conducive to culturally responsive teaching, but also lessen stress. This webinar will give you an overview of culturally responsive classroom management, as well as some specific strategies to deal with various behaviors that might be encountered in your classroom. This in turn will increase motivation as well as student engagement that you will learn about in the other webinars in this series. Please have paper and writing utensils ready to make notes during this webinar as we look not only at information but ask some probing questions. This will be called a reflection journal for sake of clarity. Let's get started by defining what culturally responsive management looks like in the classroom. Culturally responsive classroom management involves a continuous process of learning and reflection. It includes an understanding of the influence of culture, gender, ability, and socioeconomic status on students' communication, patterns of learning, and classroom behavior, as well as teachers' expectations and interactions. It would be my guess that we all pretty much would agree with this above assumption, but let's take a little closer look at some preconceived notions. Here are some questions to get you started and to get you thinking. Go ahead and get out your reflection journal. As we look at the following questions, think about your gut reaction and thoughts. This isn't about what you think you should say, but about how you can incorporate new ideas into your existing thoughts about classroom management. Which makes the most sense for classroom management practices? Treat all learners differently or treat all learners the same? Discuss how communication, learning and motivation, values, and behavior can be influenced by culture. How can these differences cause problems in the classroom? How can differing communication patterns and behavioral styles be accommodated in the classroom? How can classroom teachers become aware of these influences? How can they create a classroom practice that allows for as well as celebrates diversity? And why are children from diverse cultures sometimes at a disadvantage in a classroom? Weinstein, Tomlinson, Clark, and Curran developed a 5-part concept of culturally responsive classroom management derived from the literature on culturally responsible pedagogy, multicultural counseling, and caring. These are the 5 parts. Recognition of one's own cultural lens and biases, knowledge of students' cultural backgrounds, awareness of the broader social, economic, and political context, ability and willingness to use culturally appropriate management strategies, and commitment to building caring classroom communities. In turn, the goal of classroom management is to create an environment in which students behave appropriately from a sense of personal responsibility, not from a fear of punishment or desire for a reward. As such, the environment must acknowledge and be responsive to who are the students, cognitively, socially, and emotionally, and create a safety net that is equitable and responds to what teachers know about their students. Let's look at the first concept, recognition of one's own cultural lens and biases. A helpful step for all teachers is to explore and reflect upon where their assumptions, attitudes, and biases come from, and to understand that how they view the world can lead them to misinterpretation of behaviors and inequitable treatment of culturally different students. What can teachers do to reduce these inequities? Let's think about our own cultural competence for a minute. Our perceptions and values might feel stable, but they're actually influenced by social forces. For example, you might be surprised at how different ethnicities respond to this prompt. Suppose you are on a boat with a mother, your spouse, and your child. Suddenly, the boat begins to sink. You determine that you can only save one of the other passengers. Whom do you save? You can pause the video here if you'd like and discuss this with your group. What would you do? What was your reasoning? Of the U.S. citizens who answer the question, 60% decide to save their spouse and 40% save their children. In contrast, Asian populations assert that they would save their mothers nearly 100% of the time because you can have more kids and marry again, but you can only get one mother. The point is that multiple cultures looking at the same problem often invent different solutions, solutions that individuals without cultural competence would label as wrong. The second part of culturally responsive classroom management is knowledge of students' cultural backgrounds. In addition to becoming aware of biases, in order to develop skills for cross-cultural interaction, teachers need to become knowledgeable of students' cultural backgrounds. Gaining general knowledge about a cultural or ethnic group can give teachers a sense of views about behavior, rules of decorum and etiquette, communication and learning styles too. However, you need to be careful not to form stereotypes. Some things you might want to consider are these. Form study groups to read culturally responsive literature that reflects the identities of the students in the classroom. Work with students to develop family history projects in which students explore their cultural backgrounds and share them with the class. Conduct home visits and consult with parents and community members to gain insight. Some areas to explore might include family background and structure, education, interpersonal relationship styles, discipline, time and space, religion, food, health and hygiene, history, traditions, and holidays. As a teacher, one of the best yet difficult things I did was to visit students in their home and then later had parent conferences. As we have talked about diversity, it became even more apparent that my students did not have the same upbringing as I did, and often I found we didn't have as much in common with each other as I might have originally thought. It's very eye-opening for me as a teacher, and it left a lasting impression. The third part of culturally responsive classroom management is awareness of the broader social, economic, and political context. Teachers can engage each other and their students in conversations about real issues that touch their lives. They might form a study circle to examine structures and policies and whether they are fair to everyone. Look at what you see as inappropriate student behavior and discuss if they actually are incidents of student resistance to what they see as an unfair system. Create a critical social justice classroom grounded in the lives of children that involves dialogue, question and problem posing, critiquing bias and attitudes, and teaching activism for social justice. For example, teachers may engage students in a discussion of school or classroom rules. Today's political climate can be a very hot topic. Remember that those conversations can be very worthwhile. However, it is important to set some discussion guidelines to help students deal with some controversial topics with respect to all viewpoints. Another important guideline to remember is that discussions and conversations need to be fact-based, and remember each of us will look at the issues through our own cultural lens. The fourth part of culturally responsive classroom management is the ability and willingness to use culturally appropriate management strategies. The next step along this path is to reflect on the ways that classroom management practices promote or obstruct equal access to learning. These practices include creating a physical setting that supports academic and social goals, establishing and maintaining expectations for behavior, and working with families. Culturally responsive classroom managers filter their decision-making about the environment through the lens of cultural diversity. They think about ways the environment can be used to communicate respect for diversity, to reaffirm connectedness and community, and to avoid marginalizing and disparaging students. Some tools and strategies for organizing the physical environment may include world maps that highlight students' countries of origin. Signs or banners can welcome students in the different languages they speak. Posters can depict people of various cultural groups. Children's individual photographs can be mounted on poster board and then used to create a jigsaw puzzle. Display books that promote themes of diversity, tolerance, and community. Desks arranged in clusters allow students to work together on activities, share materials, have small group discussions, and help each other with assignments, and set up a kindness box. It is important to establish clear expectations for behavior that students understand. To avoid the possibility of confusion and misunderstanding that can lead to disciplinary interventions, teachers need to be explicit about their expectations. Engage students in discussions about the class norms. Model the behavior they expect. Provide opportunities for students to practice. And be aware of inconsistency in application of consequences. Communicating and collaborating with families is an important but challenging part of the classroom management. When teachers and families come from different cultural backgrounds, the challenges are even greater. Things for teachers to keep in mind. Some families don't see direct involvement in schooling as part of their responsibility, although they are committed to their children's education. And teachers and parents may have different expectations about what constitutes appropriate school behavior. Assume that all parents care about their children and have something to offer. Encourage families to provide insight that will help teachers teach them. Be sensitive to cultural differences in communication styles with parents and students. And finally, the fifth part of culturally responsive classroom management is the commitment to building caring classroom communities. Students often make decisions of what they do in class based on their perception of whether or not the teacher cares about them. Students are more likely to succeed if they feel connected to school, and a positive, respectful relationship with teacher helps create such an environment. Poor classroom management threatens school connectedness because a poorly managed classroom cannot provide a stable environment for respectful and meaningful student learning. Marzano concluded that good teacher-student relationships are important to effective classroom management, and there is much research to support the belief that good student-teacher relationships enhance learning. For example, in a study, Weinstein suggests that teachers set the tone by greeting students at the door with a smile and a welcoming comment, expressing admiration for a student's bilingual ability, and commenting enthusiastically about the number of different languages represented in class, and beginning each day with a morning meeting where students greet one another by name and discuss upcoming lessons. Marzano wrote that virtually anything you do to show interest in students as individuals has a positive impact on their learning, and makes several suggestions as well, including greeting students outside of school, such as extracurricular events or at stores, singling out a few students each day in the lunchroom and talking to them, and being aware of and commenting on important events in students' lives, such as participation in sports, drama, or other extracurricular activities. At this time, I want you to pause and reflect. Take out your reflection journal and list some things you do that creates a caring classroom community, and some things you'd like to implement both in and out of the classroom. You can now pause this video for reflection. Now that you have had time to reflect, let's get some more ideas for relationship building. Cultural competence begins with relationship building. There is no way to memorize the social nuances of every culture and subculture. So be curious. Ask questions of cultural brokers. Those are individuals who can facilitate understanding between two cultures. And show students that you care. To build rapport, talk directly to children outside of class using their names. Also begin class by checking in, asking kids how they're doing, even if the misbehavior of the previous class reached biblical proportions. Let's look at some tips to help culturally responsive classroom management. These are tips you can easily use in your classroom tomorrow and will either reiterate what you are doing right or maybe give you pause about some things you may want to do differently. Monitor your discourse style. Indirect requests such as, "Would you like to let me finish reading the directions?" can confuse some children who are used to receiving explicit directives from their working class parents. Think about your child's background and ability to discern what has been asked. Clarify expectations. If you put students into groups, for example, explain and model the difference between helping and doing the work for a partner. This is so important as students work in collaborative groups. One complaint I often hear from teachers about students working together is that one student does all of the work. Many students think of this as being helpful, so you will need to not only clarify, but also monitor to ensure that the expectation is met. Be sensitive to how diverse cultures deal with conflict. Many citizens of Asian countries avoid open conflict, believing that differences are best worked out quietly. Written exchanges might be preferred over face-to-face conflict resolution. It is very important to set a tone in your classroom that the loudest voice doesn't win. There are some cultures that are known for having a temper. Modeling conflict resolution strategies and acceptable ways to deal with conflict will greatly help eliminate some problems that could arise later on. Emphasize a positive environment, not just punishment. A study from the Council of State Governments Justice Center reports that classroom rule breaking decreases when welcome parties and other inviting measures are enacted. Increasing punishment fails to change student behaviors. This is not to say that there must not ever be consequences, but positive behavior supports have proven successful for students. And lastly, use humor. This is not to say laugh off non-negotiables such as bullying other students, but sometimes humor can be a great tool to help build relationships and alleviate uncomfortable situations. Remember that only no-hurt humor is allowed, and be careful with sarcasm. Many cultures do not translate sarcasm as it might be intended by you, and it can be hurtful to the student even if they don't readily act like it. Here are some ideas on humor. Laugh at yourself. When you do something silly or wrong, mention it and laugh at it. Add humorous items to test, homework, or class assignments. Keep a quotable quotes bulletin board or corner in your room. Look for humor quotes and post them, and encourage your students to do the same. Keep a cartoon file and have an area where you display 1 or 2 a day on a rotating basis, with students making the choice. Have a joke Friday. Ask students to bring in jokes to share, either to start the day on Friday, to make a transition between lunch and the following class, or at the end of the day. Be sure to screen the jokes in advance, of course. Ask students to try to build humor into occasional writing assignments. That will start a conversation about what is funny, how they know something is funny, and why different people find some things funny, but some things are funny to almost everyone. Have a funny hat day or a mismatched sock day or some other funny dress-up time. Build creative and humorous thinking by showing cartoons and pictures without captions and asking students to create them individually, in pair shares, or small groups. And ask students to bring in books they think are funny. Ask them to talk about why and to use examples from the book. Although it is natural for teachers to want to bolster their authority in classrooms that have a rocky start, focus on building relationships. It can make all the difference. Now, this does not mean your classroom should start out as a free-for-all. You still must set guidelines and positive expectations for behavior. Remember this saying, students don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. This is so true. Dre and Wisniewski point out that mindfulness makes space for alternative interpretation of student behavior and gives teachers the opportunity to respond differently. They offer a process to help you do this. This would not necessarily be feasible to do with each student, but think to those difficult students. You know, the ones that can feel like they are harder to deal with than the entire class, the ones that you seem to have the negative stories about. The protocol is framed around 3 cognitive processes involved in how we make sense of what's going on around us: description, interpretation, and evaluation. As an example, they offer the behavior of an imaginary student, Enrique, during a reading activity. Let's start with the description. Enrique raised his hand 10 times during the story read aloud is a description of what occurred in the classroom. A description is an account of what a person observed, heard, or experienced. A description does not attribute social significance to the behavior. Interpretation, in contrast, is the process of inferring what the behavior meant by attributing social significance to it. There are 3 interpretations of Enrique's behavior. 1. Enrique was disruptive during story read aloud. 2. Enrique enjoyed the story. Or 3. Enrique wanted attention. There are probably shades of truth in each of the interpretations, but do you find yourself always looking to the one in the negative light? Could you use positive behavior supports to help Enrique curb this behavior while also giving him some positive reinforcement for being attentive? Evaluation is the process of attributing positive or negative social significance to a behavior. Enrique wanted attention can be evaluated in various forms, from "I don't like that, Enrique needs to learn better turn-taking skills," to "I like that Enrique takes initiative during read-alouds." This is not to say that this behavior is okay and doesn't need to be refined, especially if it's disruptive to the other students, but a small conversation or modification might allow Enrique to stay engaged but also elicit more appropriate behavior. One thing I've done that worked with students such as this is giving talking chips. I'm sure you've heard of it, but I modified it a little. The student was given talking chips and could only raise his hand if he had one in his possession. If the question was inappropriate or not related to the topic, they had to give 2 chips instead of 1. If they blurted out, they had to give up 3. Instead of calling him out, I would just give them the peace sign or the OK sign with 3 fingers and he would know. It was a cue between us. I've even used this with quiet students to encourage participation. Interpretation and evaluation are strongly influenced by our cultural lenses and experiences. It is the place where shifts must happen. Dre and Wisniewski skillfully lay out steps for cultivating what they call mindful reflection to help teachers check their assumptions about what a student's behavior might mean. Mindful reflection as a process for developing culturally responsive practices is one of my go-to articles when supporting teachers who are working on their cultural responsiveness. There are 6 steps to the process. Explain the attributions that you have about the student. Write out and reflect on your feelings and thoughts when working with the student. Consider alternative explanations by reviewing your documentation and reflections. Check your assumptions. Make a plan and continuously revisit this process to reassess your attributions and your progress with the student. Let's drill each down in this process for mindfulness. Step 1, explain the attributions that you have about the student. When unpacking attributions about students in the classroom, ask yourself the following questions. Have I already interpreted the behavior? Am I making assumptions about why the student behaves the way that he or she does? Have I already passed judgment on whether the behavior was good or bad? Stop and describe what you and the student said and did, and in what order. What leads you to believe that the behavior was wrong or desirable? And what about the behavior leads to your interpretation? Isolated incidents rarely paint the clearest picture of the situation, so teachers should collect notes on at least 3 incidents of student behavior over an extended period of time, at least over a 2 to 4 week period, and at different times of the day, across content areas and different instructional settings. The goal is not to blame or label the student or the behavior. The emphasis is on listening, observing to understand, and being willing to learn something new and different. Step 2 for mindfulness is to write out and reflect on your feelings and thoughts when working with the student. Take into account potential issues of deficit thinking, prejudice, and overgeneralizations. After a teacher has recalled the interaction, she or he may also reflect on her or his attitudes and feelings toward the student during the interaction. As Jacobson in his article Teaching Exceptional Children suggests, educators must constantly engage in self-reflection about their assumptions and attitudes toward students. If they are to imagine alternative possibilities to relating to others, they must acknowledge the depth of their perspectives. Teachers can ask themselves the following questions. What attributes am I assigning to the student? Have I evaluated, interpreted, or described the behavior? How does this student make me feel? What are my worries or fears? What are my assumptions, and why do I find the student's behavior problematic? At this point, the teacher has acknowledged his or her prejudices or deficit thinking, despite the difficulty and uncomfortable feelings that this reflection may reveal. The teacher reflects on and rewrites interpretive or evaluative statements in descriptive terms and begins to rethink why she or he responded to the student in a particular way. Step 3 for mindfulness is to consider alternative explanations by reviewing your documentation and reflections. This next part of the process more deeply examines the ways in which the teacher communicates and perceives the student and situation and reconsiders the initial interpretations. Review the explanations and reflect on the reasons that the student may be doing what he or she does. Consider how this student's behavior is similar to or different from other behaviors in the classroom. Teachers can ask themselves the following questions. Have I already interpreted the behavior? Am I making assumptions about why the student behaves the way that he or she does? Have I already passed judgment on whether the behavior was good or bad? Stop and describe what you and the student said and did, and in what order. What leads you to believe that the behavior was wrong or desirable? What about the behavior leads to your interpretation? Sometimes we react from a preconceived script. Using this documentation will help see if there might be a pattern. In regards to culturally responsive teaching, are we seeing students through a lens that may be clouded? Step 4 is to check your assumptions. Ask yourself the following questions. Does the student's family notice the same behavior at home? How do family members interact with the student at home? Have there been any major changes or upsets in the home? Share your reflections with a colleague, parents, and/or community members. Meet with parents to learn more about expected and observed behaviors in the home. After you have reflected on the behavior and developed alternative explanations as well as possible biases, check your assumptions with individuals with specialized training on working with diversity, staff members who are familiar with or from local community culture, parents, and community members who are familiar with cultural norms of behavior. Consider talking with other professional personnel who specialize in multiculturalism, English as a second language, or bilingual education. Be wary of colleagues or informants who blame the student, community, or home life for the student's behavior. Instead, you want someone who understands the deeper meaning of behavior and can offer alternative explanations that can help you unpack attributions and reframe them in a way that leads to productive solutions and positive outcomes for students. Step 5 is to make a plan. Ask yourself the following questions. How can you change or respond differently? What additional resources do you need to implement the plan effectively? After teachers have considered alternative explanations and developed a different interpretation of a situation, they are finally able to change their behavior. Teachers can experiment with responding differently, noting what happens and reflecting on their reactions and feelings as well as on the student's response. And the last step in the process for mindfulness is step 6, to continuously revisit this process to reassess your attributions and your progress with the student. Dealing with attributions in the classroom can be a complex and layered process, and educators should view dealing with attributions as an opportunity to learn more about others and about themselves. Therefore, educators must continuously review their relationship with the student and evaluate how their instruction and communication support the student's success in class. Educators should view this process as continuous and ongoing by revisiting each step as needed to ensure that all students are experiencing success in the classroom. Again, this is not for every student, but will give you some ideas of ways to be proactive with students, even with those with special needs. Let's move on to the approach of positive discipline. The past slides we've looked at alternate responses for teachers' behaviors, and now we will give you some tools for positive discipline. Positive discipline techniques require practice and patience. Enlist the help of parents as well as other teachers and school personnel. Don't expect immediate results, but do recognize and reward small acts of positive behavior. First, define a goal. Look toward the long term. What's important for students to know and value? Self-reflect, empathy, responsibility, cooperation, consideration, tolerance. Keep this goal in mind. Secondly, recognize positive steps. What behaviors, feelings, attitudes, or skills move students toward that goal? Accepting compliments and corrections, asserting their needs, concentrating on their work, appreciating another viewpoint, understanding the effects of their behavior, listening, sharing. Practice recognizing these attitudes and actions. And third, reinforce positives. Reinforce even the smallest steps forward. Help students notice their accomplishments and appreciate the accomplishments of others by offering praise, applause, tickets, and other rewards when appropriate. Fourth, disarm negatives. What can be done about the negative behaviors and attitudes that impede progress? Do what's needed to take away their power. Ignore, change the focus, offer positive alternatives. Never give negative behavior status by publicly reprimanding or by writing names on the blackboard or by engaging in an argument. And finally, appreciate progress. How can you maintain optimism? Measure progress often. Remember where you began and appreciate every step forward. As we come to the end of this webinar, let's reflect for a second on overall classroom management and success in the culturally responsive classroom. There are 3 premises that must be at work. Focus on your overall classroom management style and school of thought. The current system you have must be working at least at a bare minimum. Focus on cultural behaviors. Are you able to distinguish between behaviors that are culturally inappropriate and behaviors that are wrong, harmful, or bad? And focus on instruction. Engaged students are less disruptive without a doubt. And to truly focus on instruction, consider this breakdown of how to handle the focus on cultural behaviors. Recognize the behavior as cultural or not. If cultural, validate and affirm the behavior first, then build and bridge to situationally appropriate behavior. If not cultural, then go to a classroom management system. And for our parting words today, let's pause and think on this quote by Barbara Shade. Cognitive styles, cultural behaviors, are the intellectual aspects of learning styles and represent culturally attuned ways of perceiving, organizing, and evaluating information. These aspects include and affect perceptions, conceptualizations, and decision-making. Culture acts as a filter in this process. During this webinar, it is our hope that you may see some things from a different perspective while obtaining some strategies that will help you build and maintain a culturally responsive management system in your culturally responsive classroom.